Welcome to another edition of the Voice of Palestine, Voice of the Palestinian People. It's September 7, 2013, and I'm your co-host, Hanna Qawas. This week we'll be talking with Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh from Palestine, an author, activist, and educator at Bethlehem and Birzeit Universities. Mazin will discuss the Oslo Accords 20 years after the current Palestinian-Israeli so-called negotiations, and we will also talk about the situation in Syria. Good evening to you, Mazin, and welcome again to the Voice of Palestine.
Good evening, and thank you for hosting me.
The Oslo, on the, I believe the 13th of this month, will be 20 years exactly. It seems, the situation is way worse than when we started 20 years later, from all sorts of aspects. So why you think these people are still negotiating in the so-called Palestinian Authority?
Well, when you say it's worse, it's actually, from here, from Bethlehem, I can assure you that it's horrible. The situation is intolerable. In 1993, when the Oslo Accords, the first Oslo Accord was signed, there was 150,000 settlers in the West Bank, between 150,000 to 200,000. Today, there are over 600,000 Israeli Jewish settlers living on Palestinian land, stolen Palestinian land in the West Bank. And every day there's more home demolitions, more destructions, more harassment of the local people. So indeed the situation is really getting to a point of an intolerable situation. And the people here all know this. I think the politicians know this. I think the American government knows it. The Israeli government knows it. They know that this is not a sustainable situation. The question you posed is, why do the people who engage in negotiations continue to engage in these useless negotiations? And of course, the people that are engaged in negotiations in this case are the Palestinian Authority represented by Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, and the Israeli government represented by Mr. Netanyahu and his assistant now, Tzipi Livni. Those who are engaged in those kind of negotiations, they do them because it serves their political purpose, which is to keep the process going, a so-called peace process, at the expense of the actual development of peace. The idea is that the process is more important than peace, and so they want to make sure that this process continues, and they have vested interest in continuing this process, if need be, for another 20 years, because their salaries, their income, their status quo is useful to those people.
While creating facts on the ground that really detrimental to the Palestinian people interest and struggle, basically.
Yes, for the Israelis, definitely. This is part of the reason, is when people try to complain about Israel and what it's doing, then Israel has a ready answer. The answer is, why are you complaining about us? We are engaged in a peace process, we're talking. And so we've been talking for 20 years, but the reality is that this is not a useful substitute for a progress, a real peace progress.
Yeah, and aside from creating facts on the ground, that's really, by stealing land and building settlements, etc., it was a political cover, really, for other regimes all over the world to normalize relation with Israel. And the best example is the the Israeli-Jordanian Accord.
Indeed, and not only that, but over 100 countries normalized relations with Israel after the beginnings of the Oslo process. So this was a fruit that Israel is getting from engaging in a process, but not in actual doing the the actual peace. So that's why I think they continue in it. And it's very beneficial. And also, as you mentioned, a cover for increased settlement activity by ensuring that people continue to ignore the flagrant violations of international law and international humanitarian law.
Yeah, and that's really the point. I mean, aside from the national aspiration of the Palestinian people, they are really violating, the 4 Geneva Convention and the human rights, the UN Human Rights Charter, basically, but on the human rights level of the Palestinian people. You mentioned that many times before, that was one of the failing of the Oslo Accord, that it didn't mention the humanitarian aspect of the situation in Palestine. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, Oslo is designed with one thing in mind, which is to ensure Israel's security. And the way I can explain it is that it is as if a thief comes to your house, steals your products, and then the only negotiations allowed with the thief is about the security of the thief, not about the return of the theft, the return of the products that are stolen. This is the only option that's available to the victims, is to discuss the security of the victimizer, basically. And of course, the victims sometimes resist. And a woman being raped, for example, may fight for herself. She may scratch even, and so forth. And for us to insist that the rapist must remain completely safe as they continue raping is really an abomination, in my humble opinion, of what is justice, what is human rights. The first thing that we should demand of the rapist is that he stops raping. And then we can start talking about punishment, restitution, restorative justice, things like that. In this case, obviously, Israel continues to rape Palestine, to steal our land, as they continue to just want to say, we are talking. Well, I think talking is not the way to solve this problem, especially when you have a very strong party, like in the case of Israel, talking to their victims, basically, the people that they have in jail. Palestinians, we basically live in jail, a large ghetto that's controlled by Israel to kill Palestinians with impunity, as they did last week in Kalandia refugee camp, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, actually the line was a bit fuzzy, so maybe you should repeat what you were saying about Kalandia.
Yes, Israel continues every day to violate basic Palestinian human rights. This was evident even last week when Israeli forces shot at unarmed civilians in Kalandia, killing 3 young people and injuring over a dozen, some of them very, very critical injuries. And Israel does this on a daily basis in the occupied territories because Israel has the power and considers that it might make it right.
Yeah, and there was a demo in Ramallah to protest that, and you did in one of your posts that it's not only the 3 were killed, there was another one was killed by the so-called security, the Palestinian security services. Could you tell us a bit, because we didn't hear much about this, the killing?
Yes. This is the ironic situation here, is that in Askar refugee camp near Nablus, Palestinian security forces go inside and they're confronted by young people from the camp who refuse to let the Palestinian Authority security people proceed to kidnap people from the camp. And so what did the Palestinian Authority people do? They shot at people and killed one young man in the refugee camp, executed him basically. And so I think, we see on the one hand Israeli soldiers killing Palestinians in a refugee camp. We also see Palestinian security forces killing individuals in a refugee camp. This is the irony of the situation, that the Palestinian Authority has become basically a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation.
Yeah, and also they are trained by really the American CIA and Canadian CSIS and the MI5, because they are all participating in the training of the security forces under the leadership, it was under the leadership of General Dayton, the American general. So, and he stated clearly that he's training them to protect Israel, not to protect Palestinian people from aggression or occupation.
Indeed, this is precisely actually written, documented in the Oslo documents themselves. This is the task of the Palestinian police and security services, is to protect Israel, to protect the rapists from any resistance by the victims. This is the irony of where we have reached at this stage in our development. And this is why we had demonstrated. And last week when we demonstrated in front of, in Ramallah, and tried to walk towards Samukapa area, towards the headquarters of the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, we were confronted by Palestinian soldiers with cops who started beating people. And one of my friends, Basil Laraj, was beaten over the head and had his, basically a few stitches on his head from his wound. And they even beat girls who were demonstrating there. And then they insulted the people there, saying that these are leftists and they are too liberal for conservative Palestinian society and things like that, which is, of course, irrelevant to the issue at hand, which is the freedom of expression and the violation of basic human rights by Palestinian security services on the behest of the American government, which works for the service of the Israeli lobby in Washington.
Yeah, and if they want to be conservative, maybe they should join Hamas.
Yes.
Rather than,
Indeed, when it suits their services. Actually, we joked about that next time these girls should come wearing hijab and niqab even, maybe then they won't be beaten by the Palestinian security. But obviously we know that's not the case.
That's not the case, It's just an excuse, really, to try to, slander the demonstrator and discredit them.
Right.
It's really encouraging to see these movements now, because I think it's about time, after 20 years of failed policies, and I call it more than failed, it's collaborationist policies, and it is, to me, it's treacherous, it's betraying the Palestinian people's struggle and aspirations. But it's encouraging to see there is a movement in spite of the hardships. There is resistance, an ongoing resistance against not just occupation, but against the collaborationist policies of the so-called Palestinian Authority. And I say so-called because it's no authority, really. The authority is all in the hands of Israel. What do you think?
Indeed. I mean, Abu Mazin, who is the president of this authority, cannot even get in or out of the country without permission from the Israelis. We have a Ministry of Transportation, and the Minister of Transportation himself, a Palestinian Minister of Transportation, cannot move on the roads without permission from the Israelis, let alone build roads or anything like that. So I think we know that this is all just propaganda, that we have an authority. We really do not have an authority. And the only authority that these people have is the authority to suppress dissent among Palestinians, dissent aimed at liberation, freedom.
Yeah, resistance to occupation too, which is legitimate under international law.
Yes.
Yeah. So, do you have really confidence in the future, and do you see the Palestinian people saying enough is enough, you don't represent me, not in my name?
Yeah, I do. I'm very hopeful. I think, as long as there's life here, as long as there are people here, there is the potential for changing the status quo. And as an amateur historian, if you want, I wrote a book on nonviolent resistance in Palestine. I saw that over the past 130 years, we've had 13 to 15 uprisings, and these waves of resistance come and go. We're now in between wave, or maybe the beginning of a new wave of uprising. It's challenging, of course, because we have the Palestinian Authority in our way, trying to prevent any resistance to the occupation. But I think in the long run, things will change, and they must change, because the status quo is certainly intolerable and cannot continue.
Yeah, and the so-called peace accords, really been violated by Israel on many occasions. The major one I recall in 2002 when they entered so-called Area A and attacked Bethlehem and all the main cities in the West Bank, and they occupied, demolished al-Muqata'a, etc., etc. So Israel is violating the Oslo Accord that's signed and witnessed by the U.S. President, but still Israel doesn't get any punishment or any on the international level, the level of the United Nations. The U.S. always protects Israel, which encourages it in continuing with this human rights violation. I believe since 1972 till now there is 43 vetoes to protect Israel from punishment or putting it to task for what they're doing in Palestine. So what do you think of the enablers, in Washington?
Well, let me clarify one point that you made about the Oslo Accords. Oslo Accords are interim arrangements. They are not peace accords. They are interim arrangements. They were supposed to last for 5 years.
That's true.
When Israel is violating what they are violating interim arrangements. For those 5 years, they violated these interim arrangements, and then they continue to claim that these interim arrangements continue in force, even though they are actually expired, because they serve their status quo. But even those interim accords, which are very, very unjust for the Palestinians, Israel violates and picks and chooses which parts of the agreements, so-called, that they want to enforce. And the part that they insist on, which is the part I keep mentioning, which is that the Palestinian Authority must act as a subcontractor for the occupation under the interim accords. The interim accords expired in 1998, and here we are 15 years later, and Israel continues to violate their own obligations under the interim accord, while insisting the Palestinians maintain the interim accord parts that have to do with the security of the State of Israel. So that's where the situation is. Now, who enables this violation of international law and basic human rights? You are absolutely right. It's no other than the biggest purveyor of violence in the world. These are the words of Martin Luther King, and that is the United States government. The United States government continues to supply arms and ammunition to repressive regimes, including the State of Israel, an apartheid state, and continues to foment violence around the world and have its army. The U.S. Army is now in over 140 countries, obviously not playing cards or swimming pools and so forth. They're engaged in active repression and active violations of basic human rights and enabling others to violate human rights.
Yeah.
And Israel, I think, is the quintessential example of this, because Israel's situation is very unique in many ways among these repressive regimes that the United States supports and funds, in that Israel is not just an occupied power, it's colonizing power. It's a power that intends on ethnic cleansing and what somebody called genocide and another person called politicide of the native Palestinian people. Israel acts today as the Europeans acted in North America in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, and Israel dealt with far more brutality and violence and repressive measures in the 21st century, which is very unprecedented.
Yeah, not to mention their support to the most autocratic regimes in the area, while they claim they're trying to liberate other people from tyrants, like in the case of Syria, they're supporting one of the most autocratic regime in the world, that's Saudi Arabia. I mean...
Well, the Syrian situation is a very sad situation, and it's a very critical situation, because if the U.S. and Israel succeed in their plans for Syria, then we are all in trouble. And when I say we are all in trouble, I mean we humans will be in trouble. Because the U.S. will have completed its hegemony over the Middle East with the help of Israel, suppressing any potential for liberating the Arab people from autocratic repressive regimes around the Middle East, and would have basically ensured that Israel is strengthened in its position vis-a-vis what it intends to do, which is to finish all the remaining Palestinians.
Yeah, and the autocratic regime really, especially the kingdoms from Morocco to Saudi Arabia to the emirs of Kuwait and the new king of Bahrain, he wasn't happy with his title as emir. He upgraded himself to a king. So all these kingdoms really, and not to mention Jordan, these are really autocratic regimes that suppress dissent and suppress their people in the benefit of the U.S. imperial interests. So to say, they are trying to liberate Syria or liberate the Syrian people is really outright lie and hypocrisy.
Well, yes, indeed. And what we are seeing in Syria now is that over 100,000 mercenaries from around the Middle East and from Europe and North America and Chechnya and others are being paid by Saudi Arabia, bought and paid for by Saudi Arabia, oil money that belongs to the people of Saudi Arabia, that the royal family has hijacked from the people of Saudi Arabia. There's huge poverty in Saudi Arabia, and yet this money is being used to fund a destructive war in Syria, because the U.S. and Israel like this war, and they like the idea of bringing the Iran, Syria, Lebanon act of resistance that potentially could resist Israel, and that's what they want to do, is they want to destroy it. But on the positive side, China and Russia are understanding this, and they're refusing to play this game, and they're refusing to allow the U.S. to act as the bully of the Middle East.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know if you've seen an article by the right-wing American politician Pat Buchanan, who said, in his article, which really interested me, that the Saudis promised the American to pay for the cruise missiles they're gonna use in Syria. So that means they are gonna pay for the war, basically, with their.
The Saudis paid a huge chunk of the war in Iraq, even though in the end the American taxpayers were left holding the bag to the tune of another $2 to $3 billion. So of debt, basically. So I don't know that the Saudis or the Americans have enough money to keep fomenting wars in the Middle East first against Iraq and then Afghanistan and now Pakistan and Yemen. We have to remember that American airplanes are still bombing like Yemen, Sudan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, other places. And add one more war, I am not sure they can afford it financially. The U.S. economy is already saddled with a huge amount of debt, and the American taxpayers one of these days are going to wake up and realize that they've been duped by the politicians.
Yeah, and really who's benefiting from these ventures is the military-industrial complex that's selling in 2011 they sold around $66 billion of arms. Half of it went to the so-called Gulf countries. The main one was Saudi Arabia, which purchased 33 billion of weapons. I mean, it's keeping the economy going. So in essence, Saudi Arabia also is helping the American economy grow or not to go over the cliff like it should do because of the debt, like you said. So in essence, these reactionary Arab regimes are really supporting the American economy, and by extension they are supporting the existence of the State of Israel.
Well, I would disagree with you on that. I don't think the American economy is helped by being a war economy. I think that those days the military spending helps fuel economic growth, if they ever existed, have long passed. I think it is now clearer and clearer that wars bankrupt countries and not help their economies.
Yeah.
So I really think taxpayers will understand this if they just look at the simple math of government debt and how much each one of them or their children now owe to countries like China and Japan and other countries buying U.S. treasuries and so forth.
Yeah, I think you're right on the long run because it's a bankrupt.
Basically, it's basically hostage the future of America, holding the future of America hostage, and putting it in the hands of responsible people who do not really care about the U.S. economy. They care only about themselves and their pet. Zionist project being the State of Israel. Yeah. My phone is running out of batteries.
You want me to phone you again to continue on the landline?
Up to you.
I could do that. Yeah, I'll just pause. Hello, hi, Mazin.
Hi.
Yeah, so that sounds better actually. Also.
Okay.
So
right, but I also shouldn't stay too long, if you don't mind.
Sure. We'll just wrap it up maybe. And just I want to mention about the situation in Syria. The one who are pushing for war also against Syria. It's not only the Arab country, but they have common partners. The Zionist lobby in the U.S. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I'm sorry, say that
again. They have partners that are pushing for the war against Syria. The Saudis have partners, including the Zionist lobby in the U.S.
Yes, I mean, there's a collusion of interest here that's very obvious. I mean, part of the reason is that Hezbollah in Lebanon was able to resist Israel, and the ideas of resistance to the U.S. imperial and Israeli hegemonic presence in the Middle East is spreading, and there are more and more people in the Middle East who are saying these are not such massive powers that they cannot be resisted when they steal our land. We can resist. This provides a danger to people like the ruling family in Saudi Arabia, which has relied for its total existence as a ruling family in Saudi Arabia on the U.S. cover, basically, a U.S. cover of its atrocities, of its torture of its own people, so on, because the U.S. likes the Saudis, and because they keep the oil prices low, and the Saudi royal family represses its own people from resisting the U.S. and Israeli hegemony. So they like the Saudi royal family, and so there's a collusion of interest between the Saudi royal family, the Israeli government, the American government.
Yeah.
And of course, these governments pressure through all sorts of tactics, the European Union and others, into following their lead. As I said, there's a significant shift, though, because now they seem to be losing grip on major powers. China and Russia being good examples, that they are asserting their independence and their ability to judge for themselves, to look at the lies of the American government, the Israeli government about, for example, the lie about the Syrian government using chemical weapons to kill its own citizens. This is just as much a lie as the lie that they did about Saddam Hussein taking babies out of incubators in the hospital in Kuwait. These lies that have been perpetuated are now being exposed, and the Russian intelligence agencies and the Chinese intelligence agencies and other governments, and even small countries like Venezuela, are now showing some resistance to U.S. imperialism and the designs of the U.S.-Israeli imperialism in those areas.
Yeah, but it's interesting that AIPAC is really declaring publicly that they support the U.S. strike on Syria. That shows basically they're doing it before the Congress votes on the issue. So they're basically pressuring the lawmakers in the U.S. to support this.
Yes, and I think we should publicize this as wide and clear as possible, because these are the same people who pushed for the catastrophic war in Iraq based on lies,
That's right.
who are now pushing for a catastrophic war in Syria based on lies, and who will next push for a catastrophic war in Iran based on lies. All of these wars do not benefit a single American citizen. They benefit only the Zionist project, and they benefit the bankruptcy of America. So that Zionism will end up being a superpower, and America will end up being in the backwater of the Pacific with nobody caring about it anymore. So I think from a national interest standpoint, the American people should wake up to what's happening. And I think publicizing the role of the Israeli lobby in pushing for these wars is an important tool in our arsenal of educational tools.
And we've seen the effects of the war in Iraq. That's what led to the collapse in 2008 of the American economy. It's a direct result, really, but the politicians don't tell you that, really. I wanna wrap it up. Today there was a demo against negotiations in Ramallah. Were you at it, and could you tell us what happened there?
Yes, there were hundreds of people. I went to Ramallah for this demonstration. Also, there was a conference in Ramallah about the future of Palestine by an organization called Muwatin, which is the initiative for the promotion of democracy. And we wanted to speak in both the conference and in the demonstration to the fact that we want democracy here, and that we Palestinians, the people from the streets, are suffering a dual occupation, the occupation by Israel, and now the occupation by the Palestinian Authority, which is trying to suppress freedom of expression, the freedom of people to demonstrate even, and to reach, within letters today, even to reach the United Nations park where we would have gathered and had speeches. This is a kind of repressive system that is emblematic of those serving American and Israeli hegemonic powers.
Yeah. Okay, just one final word. How can people support the Palestinian struggle, and what do you think of the nonviolent movement of the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction against Israel?
Well, I think people need to first educate themselves about what's going on, to understand the connections between all these things, to understand the connections between the U.S., the growing debt now, so that just servicing the debt now is one of the largest expenses of the U.S. government, is to just pay the interest on this massive debt, and the unsustainability of this, and to see the connections between that and those that are lobbying Congress for more wars, because obviously these people are not interested in the U.S. interest or in the interest of humanity. I think education is a key thing that people can do, educate themselves and educate others. And beyond that, as you said, people can engage in boycott, divestment, sanctions as a non-violent way to basically boycott and those we think are doing basic repression of human rights and violating international law and engaging in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I'm not talking here just about Israel, but there are American corporations also that are profiting from war and from mayhem around the world, and people can research those things on websites like whoprofits.org and so on. You can Google certainly, about who profits from occupation, colonization around the world, and they can engage in those kinds of activities.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mazin, and keep up the good work. And we are following all the, popular resistance actions that the Palestinians are doing, and you are certainly part of it. And keep up the good work. And it's a pleasure again talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Take care.
And that was Hana Kawas talking with Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh, direct from Palestine. And with that, we conclude another edition of the Voice of Palestine. I've been your co-host, Marian Kawas, and our final piece of music is the well-known song Unadikum, lyrics by the late Palestinian poet Tawfiq Ziayid. This particular version is sung by a children's choir during a concert for Gaza, and we dedicate it to the Palestinian and Arab people in their struggle against Western hegemony, domination, and interventions.